From the Mutual Broadcasting System, this is STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk. Now, retired Marine Intelligence Officer and globally recognized risk expert Hal Kempfer.
Welcome to STRAT, Strategic Risk Assessment Talk, and I'm going to discuss some really significant changes that have happened. You know, we were expecting going up into the end of this last week that there would be a possibly, because of what President Trump had said, major strikes, a dramatic increase in the operational tempo, and it didn't happen. In fact, the exact opposite happened. We found an operational pause. And there's reasons for that, and I'll kind of get into that. But what we're also seeing at the same time is a broadening of the conflict across the region in ways that we really kind of need to get in more in depth. You know, things are happening in the Red Sea, all the way up in the Caspian Sea. So I'm going to talk about that, kind of get into some of the big changes taking place and what this potentially means. Now, before I get going too far, let me just say one thing that I found very compelling. There are reports about this operational pause, and one thing that kept coming up was we're really running low on Patriot missiles, not just the U.S. and U.S. Central Command, but also our Gulf allies. The pipeline for producing Patriot missiles is, you know, compared to the requirements today, rather anemic. It's going to take a long time to catch up, and we're getting really low. And I think there was a lot of concern that if we ramped up things against Iran, that they would fire a lot of drones and ballistic missiles, and at some point we get critically low, as in starting to run out of Patriot missiles in the Middle East. And so they decided that maybe that wasn't a good way to go, that, the end state wasn't going to be decisive, certainly, that, Iran wasn't going to, wave the white flag and surrender. The regime wasn't going to walk away and allow a new democratic, government to take its place. So I think in all of that, the decision was that this wasn't the right time to do it. And so I think that was the biggest deciding factor on this. All other stuff about, there's entrees, diplomatic discussions with the Iranians and all this other stuff that's kind of positive spin on it. I really think the count of Patriot missiles available and what it would cost to, this weekend if we ramped up our military activities was really the deciding factor. So let me throw that out there right up front. First off, Iran has now fully engaged, and I'm not saying they ever disengaged, but truly fully engaged one of their major proxies in the region to go directly against what is arguably the largest Arab state, and that is Saudi Arabia. They're huge. It's big. They go all the way across, you could say the Saudi Peninsula. Well, there's a reason why we call it the Saudi Peninsula. They go all the way across. They go from Red Sea to Persian Gulf. So some days back, Reuters reported that Iran had sent Revolutionary Guard Corps personnel, men, along with military hardware to the Houthis down in Yemen, and that they flew them in. And there was a big thing about stopping the plane and all sorts of stuff like that. But they had gone in there, and this was before the group began attacking oil tankers in the Red Sea. What that attack on oil tankers has done is it's really kind of closed up the Red Sea. They said, this is amazing that a non-state actor, the Houthis, without any navy, any ships, is putting a naval blockade on Saudi Arabia. But they're doing it with drones, they're doing it with missiles, and they fired on tankers, they fired on ports, tanker ports as well. And so they've really kind of closed up the Bab el Mandeb Strait, sometimes called the Gate of Tears. But that is the strait that basically opens up, the Red Sea to not just the Gulf of Aden, but really to the Indian Ocean. This is the conduit the ships going from the Mediterranean down to the Indian Ocean have to go through the Suez Canal. They have to go through the Bab el Mandeb. So they pretty much shut that down. And this is really, and you say, this sounds familiar. Didn't they do this before? Yes, they did it before, but they hadn't done it in about a year. And what this has done is it's closed two major waterways, two major maritime choke points in the Middle East. One is that Red Sea conduit for the Suez Canal, the Bab el Mandeb now, And of course, the Strait of Hormuz is still not fully open because of what the Iranians are doing out there. So this has caused a massive disruption to global commerce, a massive disruption to supply chains around the world, and it has had huge implications well beyond just that immediate area. Right? So now there's a battle on both sides of the peninsula to keep these vital waterways open. And Saudi Arabia is right in the middle of it. And Saudi Arabia is being targeted by the Houthis with these Revolutionary Guard Corps guys literally right there. All right. Now, these military advisors, the missiles, the drone gear, all the stuff they brought in were used to attack a couple of ships. They've been used to dissuade other ships from going through the Bab el Mandeb. And so they were down there. This is very similar to what has happened with Hezbollah, where after Israel with the pager attacks and the walkie-talkie attacks, Hezbollah was really wiped out of a lot of its top operational commanders, along with all the airstrikes. And so the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps of Iran, sent in its own personnel to man tactical operation centers to get involved with operational planning, operational execution. So the Revolutionary Guard Corps, those Iranians, are actually in there thick as thieves in Lebanon, working, basically managing things on behalf of Hezbollah. And now we're seeing the same thing with the Houthis and what's going on there, which is another way to say the Iranians have basically leveraged both these groups as effectively tactical arms. They're not just proxies. They are truly tactical arms of what the Iranians are doing across the region to open up other fronts in order to draw resources away from the attacks on Iran, amongst other purposes they have. So that's what's going on there. All right. And that is a shift. Certainly with the Houthis, that's a shift. All right. It really diminishes their independence. It diminishes, Secretary Rubio came out and said that they'd been basically tricked in so many words to do this stuff on behalf of the Iranians. I would turn around and say, well, the Iranians are, if they're tricking anybody because of how they've structured it now, I think they're trying to trick themselves, but whatever. They have their own personnel in there with their fingers theoretically on the button to launch missiles and stuff. So they basically are in there in a way that they weren't in there before. All right. Now, the Houthi attacks, previous warnings by the group, they've already caused several ships to turn back, as I mentioned. The trade route has been corked up. I should mention that, among other things, yes, Saudis have been attacked directly, but a couple of major Jinzan and Yanbu ports, Yanbu being the terminus for that east-west pipeline, which has been going full tilt. That's the way you get oil out of there. Both of those have been targeted, and so it's causing big disruption in terms of getting oil anywhere in the world, to Asia, anywhere else. All right. Now, Iran has also, of course, crippled traffic going through the Strait of Hormuz. There's a unconfirmed report. I think it originally came from the Iranians, so I take it with a great grain of salt. They're saying that a tanker was blasted by a sea mine. I'm waiting to see if that happens. But if there are actually sea mines in those waterways, in those lanes, and they did hit a tanker, that would significantly change things. That could cause an end to the operational pause. Now, the Strait of Hormuz, previously, prior to the war, it carried about 20% of the world's oil. It also carried a phenomenal percentage, about almost equal for certainly liquefied natural gas was going out, a big source of fertilizer, big source of helium, which is the gas used to fabricate microchips in places like, Taiwan and elsewhere in Asia. So it was it's a major waterway. All right. And one of the ways that Saudi Arabia had offset this waterway being shut down was to, as I mentioned, use that east-west pipeline. Now, they brought that thing up to, I think it takes about 7 million barrels a day. It was operating below that capacity. It has been operating at full tilt since this thing began. They go to tankers over in Yanbu Port in the Red Sea. Now, if the tankers are going north up to Europe or somewhere else, in the Atlantic, well, then they're going to go up through the Suez Canal and out. However, most of that oil goes to Asia. And the way you get it to Asia is you take it down through the Red Sea, through the Bab el Mandeb into the Indian Ocean, and then take it across the Indian Ocean over to Asia. If you can't get the tankers through the Bab el Mandeb, you can't get most of that oil that is needed in Asia to Asia. And ASEAN, ASEAN, but I should say there's an Asia Pacific conference that's been going on this week, and that apparently was a major discussion at this conference was, how are we going to get oil? How are we going to get past this thing with the Bab el Mandeb being basically corked up by the Houthis? That's a big discussion. It's put a lot of these Asian countries as major stakeholders in maritime security in a way that they weren't looking at the Red Sea, as if they weren't concerned enough about the Strait of Hormuz. Certainly none of them want to get pulled into that conflict, but now they're looking at this thing with the Red Sea. That might end up at some point building a very different coalition. And I say this because we've had these combined task forces that have gone out there to do things, which have had numerous different members of them, particularly I think of going back to Somalia with the piracy, but also dealing with this issue of keeping the Red Sea and, access to and from the Red Sea open. This might put together a very different coalition. So that's very possible. All right. Now, right now, they have to take the tankers in Yanbu and run them up through the Suez Canal, out to the Strait of Gibraltar, around the Horn of Africa, and then out to Asia. That adds weeks and immense amount of cost and not to mention all the miles that adds to that shipment. So that has really caused major problems in supply chain. And it's delayed a lot of things that would have come out and been in Asia in a couple of weeks. Now they're looking at maybe it'll show up in a month or so, and they're looking at very diminished, depleted oil reserves. So they're obviously very, very concerned about what this could do. And that's one of the reasons you're seeing oil prices jump so much, is because there was this kind of back channel, if you will, going through the Red Sea and the Bab el Mandeb to get a lot of stuff out there. And that was kind of that access to that oil and the amount of oil coming out was making a big difference in keeping the oil prices worldwide somewhat lower than some of the worst expectations of what could happen. But now that has been shut down. And so that's a huge part. And that alternative route is, going around the Horn of Africa is extremely expensive. So it's a really tough thing to do. Obviously, we talked about, I mentioned the hitting of port facilities. Now to kind of bring it back, as all this was going on, one of the first things that happened is Saudis attacked the big airport in what used to be the capital city of Yemen, which is Sana'a. Their airport was hit by the Saudis very hard. Saudis have done a number of strikes there. They've also hit Hodeida, which is a port, the biggest Houthi-controlled port city, and a number of other places along the coast that the Houthis control. So they've been hitting it, and it's really interesting. And maybe it's a matter of semantics. They keep talking about this Saudi-led coalition. Now, there had been a ceasefire in place between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia for years, and this followed 10 years of pitched warfare where there was a Saudi-led coalition that included the Yemeni government that was going against them. Now, a couple of things have happened more recently that probably most haven't noticed is there were two big factions of the Yemeni government. They have combined. They now have a unified government. These factions have basically gone their ways. It was kind of weird at one point. You had Saudi Arabia was backing one, and the UAE, of all things, seemed to be involved with the other. But they have basically come together. They're working as a unified government. They control about 80% of the country. So that is in one place. And now you got the Saudis saying, look, they're looking at this thing with the Houthis, and they can only be saying this has now become an existential threat to us if we can't get this Bab el Mandeb open. And so they're going to be looking probably at some military options that they haven't been looking at before. I'm not saying they're going to do a big ground offensive operation in Yemen. That area that the Houthis controlled is very mountainous and stuff. But they could do some concerted things to the Sana'a area that the Houthis control, and doing things with massive air support. They've got about 230 plus strike aircraft at their disposal. They could do some massive strikes and things that would put the Houthis back, and then potentially open up a ground operation for Yemeni governmental forces. And I wouldn't be surprised if other countries may want to join in on this. Certainly Egypt, which had its own military expeditionary experience in Yemen that did not go well, but that was a very long time ago, might be inclined to join with the Saudi-led coalition to do something to push this back. I think the two areas we're going to look at right now is probably Sana'a and these, lower, for lack of a better term, plains type areas, not the really steep mountainous areas per se. These areas that they can get into quickly. And then the other one they're going to look at, which is pretty difficult, is the coast. And there's a lot of steep terrain along the coast too, but there is a road that runs along there, and they could shoot down the coast and basically try to cut off the Houthis and contain them in the mountains, and then maybe do a series of raids and strikes in the mountains rather than trying to take that terrain in the traditional way. They could basically just cork them up and make it, basically cut off all the supply chain, any supplies, any logistics to go to the Houthis. And then as targets present themselves, go in there and deal with them. And of course, it may not be just airstrikes. They might actually want to put boots on the ground, special operators or something like that would go in and clear out an area. And if the idea was to destroy a particular area and cause massive casualties with the Houthi forces and then pull out, well, that would be a different type of operation. So anyway, kind of getting ahead of myself there, but that's a possibility. All right, I just point that out. Now, another thing that's happened is on July 25th, Ukrainian forces carried out this long-range drone strike in the Caspian Sea. They have hit Russian ships in the Caspian Sea before, usually oil tankers and stuff, usually not full oil tankers, but oil tankers that are there. So it's not the first time that the Ukrainians have done drone strikes in the Caspian. But this was targeting vessels in the military cargo ship transshipment stuff between Iran and Russia. And that is a little bit different. All right. They confirmed the vessel was transporting, or Ukraine confirmed the vessel was transporting military cargo between Iran and Russia, including ammunition, artillery shells, body armor helmets, components for Iranian-made Shahed drones, a bunch of stuff. So they had every reason in the world to target that particular ship and those shipments. Obviously, Iran was not thrilled about this. They said the strike hit a commercial vessel, causing an explosion that killed a crew member and wounded another, and they're trying obviously to portray it in a very different sense. But and there was some confusion about which ship was hit, so Kyiv didn't actually confirm which one. But basically, what President Zelensky said was that their strike in the Caspian Sea had achieved what he called very strong results. So I think it's the same ship and it's the same thing that they hit. And this is part of a broader campaign that the Ukrainians are using against Russia. But it's fascinating because now it's hit something very much tied to Iran. And that is kind of almost bringing these two conflicts, certainly overlap, one would say. I'm not saying they're merging into one big conflict, but I am saying there is certain overlap there. And it's all tied to Russia. Russia is the common denominator between the two. Russia is the big backer of Iran. The Caspian Sea is the conduit for Russian materials to get to Iran and for Iranian materials to get to Russia. So it is not a surprise that Ukraine would go after that. And I wouldn't be surprised to see maybe the U.S. actually doing stuff with the Caspian Sea, although we got to be a little bit careful. It is not that large of a waterway. And you're talking about territorial waters of Russia up there, and I don't think we want to get directly involved doing strikes in the territorial waters of Russia, or even have strike aircraft in the vicinity of the territorial waters of Russia. So, but the Ukrainians don't have a problem with that because they're at war with Russia. So they're doing that. Now, it's long been considered Iran's probably safest maritime route to get stuff out of the country or to get stuff into the country, and now it's under direct military pressure. The incident comes amid the pause in the operations with Iran. That could change very quickly. And that was after 13 days of constant bombardment that was going on in both directions. It comes during the ongoing naval blockade of the U.S. against Iranian ports and the Houthi rebel blockade, disruption, or whatever's happening in the Red Sea and the Bab el Mandeb Strait. Russia-Iran military cooperation includes a lot of Iranian drone supply to Russia. What some analysts are saying is this is opening up a new front in the Ukraine-Iran-Russia conflict as a whole. and it's putting a lot of economic pressure against Iran. I don't know that the U.S. had a hand in working with the Ukrainians on this, but I got to tell you, it is interesting. And one of the things we could have been doing is providing them intelligence. And certainly the Russians have been providing, and the Chinese have been providing, a tremendous amount of intelligence to the Iranians, which the Iranians have then been using to target U.S. personnel and U.S. bases in the region. So I don't rule that out. I don't rule that out that some of that intelligence may have been on the Caspian Sea as well. It also raises the risk for energy and shipping markets, as the Caspian is a huge transit route for those two. So in short, the Caspian Sea tanker strike marks a significant escalation in the overall conflict, or conflicts, if you will, with Ukraine targeting Iran-Russia military supply lines, and Iran, responding right now with diplomatic protests and warnings of retaliation, blah, blah, blah. But, that's what Iran's doing right now. I should mention, and I think I mentioned earlier on, there is an unconfirmed report that a tanker was hit by a sea mine in the Red Sea. If there are sea mines laid by Iran in the Red Sea and they are hitting tankers, now if they're hitting Iranian tankers, I don't think we're going to get too concerned about it. But if they're hitting other tankers or hitting other ships, that could trigger what might be an end of this operational pause. Although I will say it's not going to change the count of Patriot missiles in the region. And so I think that condition still stays. All right. And as an aside from that last item, I just want to say that we are seeing overlap. I don't know if we're seeing a full convergence of these two wars, but it is a very surprising connection. But now you have a war that goes all the way out to the Red Sea, across the Saudi Peninsula, all right, into the Bab el Mandeb, very much certainly in the Persian Gulf region, all across the Middle East up there, and now shooting all the way up into the Caspian Sea and dealing with commerce between Russia and Iran. I have to say, this thing is just not just geographically speaking, but politically speaking, every other way, it's getting a lot bigger. And if kinetics begin in earnest again in the Persian Gulf area between Iran and the U.S., and I should also mention that we had confirmed reports recently that Bahrain and Kuwait had done airstrikes against Iran. Earlier reports are that the UAE had done airstrikes against Iran, and there were even reports that earlier in the war, Saudi Arabia had done airstrikes against Iran. Those countries have significant air capabilities, particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And so at some point, the Iranians attacking every way they can comes back to bite them. And I think, strategically speaking, they made a mistake early in this war by attacking the Gulf states. And I think they're making a mistake now by doing what they're doing with the Houthis, going against the Saudis. They may think it's a brilliant strategy. I think all you're doing is you're basically waking up a bear, which is Saudi Arabia. They are a big country. They have a lot of forces. They have been holding back on a lot of stuff. There's reports of them, some sort of diplomatic overture where the Saudis said they would hold back on attacking. But the Iranians, it's almost like the story about the scorpion and the frog. They can't help themselves with the IRGC. It's their very nature. And so now they've gone after the Saudis in a way that the Saudis can't ignore. So I think this war could change dramatically, and it could change rather quick. Hey, thanks for listening to Strat. Also, please visit stratpodcast.com. You can go to my YouTube page, Hal Kempfer TV, to see all my mini media things, my interviews with various networks and stuff and television stations. And you can always go to my website at www.gripsa.com. That's for global risk intelligence and planning. And hope you tune in for the next one. Thanks.